Welcome back to the Panther Business Briefing. I'm your host, Jayson Reed, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Baran Pourtahmaseb-Sasi. For our second episode on our theme of oil and gas, we'll be diving headfirst into the exciting world of energy policy. In our previous episode, we laid the foundation for you with insights from Dr. Parajgari on the economics and history of the industry, and today, we'll build off of that by exploring the evolution of energy policy from the Carter administration with a renewed focus on how historical events have shaped the current landscape. Joining us is Dr. Mario Loyola, a professor at FIU and fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Loyola's extensive work in environmental and administrative law, as well as his expertise in energy policy, makes him the perfect guide to walk us through this journey. But before we get into the interview, Baran here will take a moment to contextualize our discussion last week, where we just briefly touched upon energy policy.
Thanks, Jayson. Well, first and foremost, the vast differences between state-run and private oil companies create enormous headaches for domestic regulators grappling with the uncompetitive practices which still persist to this day. Like we discussed in the previous episode, the majority of the world's oil production was controlled by national oil companies. These are state-owned entities in countries like Venezuela, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. While these nations have massive oil reserves, their operations are often constrained by governmental policies, inefficiencies, and lack of responsiveness to changes in the market. As a result, they've struggled to innovate, particularly in managing their fields and adapting to new extraction technologies. This creates a huge chasm between them and privately run oil companies, like those in the United States, where market-driven incentives lead to more efficient operations and a greater flexibility to respond to price shifts. As the early 2000s rolled around, this dynamic came into clear focus when these private American firms began to revolutionize oil production through technological advances, such as fracking, that allowed access to previously unreachable oil reserves. This shale boom fundamentally changed the domestic energy landscape and gave the U.S. a much larger role in the global oil markets, improving producers' abilities to adjust their output quickly based on changes in price or demand. The efficiently run private firms could ramp up their production to meet new demand, or, conversely, reduce their production to help stabilize the prices. Compared to the inelastic nature of state-owned producers, their often slower decision-making process due to infrastructure, long-term contracts, or other generally bureaucratic hurdles make it hard for them to adapt to the price signals that the private firms excel at responding to. And so, now that we've introduced the discussion for today, let's hear what Dr. Loyola has to say in regards to the evolution of domestic energy and the turning tables of reining in boom and bust cycles.
I'm a professor at Florida International University. I'm in the Institute of Environment, and I also teach in the law school, where I teach environmental law, administrative law. And I'm also a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where I work on energy and environment issues as well, and also federalism and a lot of other a lot of other things.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Loyola, for joining us. The first question we had, and like I alluded to earlier, we're trying to build off of our discussion we had last week with Dr. Parajgari. We wanted to see if you could walk us through maybe a little bit of the history of energy policy since the Clinton administration.
Let's go back to the Carter administration.
Okay, Carter, sure.
Yeah, better.
So in the Carter administration, you may know that President Carter's White House came out with a report in 1978 or something, I think, on energy conservation, warning that if we didn't start cutting back on our use of gasoline, the world would soon hit peak oil, and then we'd start running out of gasoline, and there would be catastrophic shortages, and it would be, incident effects, inability to get food to the cities. I mean, all these kinds of parade of horribles, and we desperately needed renewable fuel mandates. This should sound familiar because every 20 years or so, there's a new world is ending scientific fad, but the solution is always the same, which is renewable fuel standards.
Right.
So that's an interesting pattern. But in any case, in 1982, and you remember that everybody was very paranoid about this in the 70s because we'd had, after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Saudis shut off oil production, oil transport to the United States and Israel and Western countries, and this caused a major shock in the middle of stagflation and everything that was really bad for Western countries. And then in 1978, around the time of the revolution in Iran, there was another oil shock.
And that's in the Carter administration, right?
People were people get traumatized by sitting in line for an hour waiting for gasoline. And so this is when the report came out that we have to start cutting back on gasoline. Anyway, flash forward 2 years into Reagan's first term, and the Saudis see a pattern, which is that a lot of non-OPEC oil is starting to come onto the market from Africa and Mexico in particular.
I think Nigeria is a big one, right?
Yeah, Nigeria is one of the main ones. Mexico is another main one. The Mexican Pemex had just discovered in 1979, 1980, a huge oil field in offshore, I think the Campeche oil field in the Gulf, yeah. And so all of a sudden you have all these non-OPEC oil producers that are starting to gobble up market share at the very elevated prices, which is, of course, the familiar problem of cartel pricing, which is that if you can't exclude new entrants, then you're going to lose market share.
Right?
Yeah. You're going to lose market share to people who can produce. Who can produce and sell at a lower price than you because you're charging a super competitive price.
Right.
They'll be able to undercut your price. Anyway, so to drive all these new entrants, I mean, I don't want to ascribe motivations to the Saudis, but I think it was that to drive all of these new entrants out of the market, they doubled oil production, and oil prices crashed around the world.
Right.
And suddenly gasoline was less than $1 a gallon again, which people had not seen since the early 70s.
Of course, that can't sustain, right?
And, it sustained for another 30 years, right? It sustained for the rest of the 80s, all the way into the 90s, and until oil didn't start to pick up again until 2004, 2005, at which time, this is a very complicated story to tell, but a very important story to tell because what was happening in 2004, of course, is that all of a sudden you've got a big new entrant on the demand side of the world economy that doesn't produce any oil of its own, which is China, right? And the Chinese are suddenly starting to come into a big way, adding huge amounts of demand and demand projections to the world oil market. And that starts to drive oil prices up in 2004, 2005. 2006, and then this ended up flipping. Oil prices didn't start going down again until the worldwide recession caused by the financial crisis in 2008. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I think it's very, very important to understand the very strange nature of the world oil production, which is that, pre-shale boom in the United States, 93% of world oil production was in the hand of national oil companies. National oil companies, by definition, are socialist enterprises that don't operate on market principles, and so they don't do things like they're not good at maintenance. They're not good at marginal investments in new field. They're not good at innovation. They're not good at a lot of things that.
Yeah, I think in our previous conversation concerning some of these more volatile oil producers, like say Venezuela, there was some conversations about how that situation kind of deteriorated over the decades.
Where the reserves are there, but the management is poor. Right?
Well, and so what they've done, just take a look at what Pemex is doing this whole time, as an example, right? And Pemex is infinitely better run than than any government agency in Venezuela. Okay, is that what you have them doing is going around to the oil fields that they have monopoly access to, taking all the oil that's easy to produce, which is about half the production of every well, right? I mean, the life cycle of an oil well is that you have to get through, of a normal oil well, let's say. I don't know if this is the same for a frac for a fracking operation is much more complicated. But for a normal oil well, you just, like in Saudi Arabia, you just throw a stick of dynamite somewhere, oil comes up, and it just keeps gushing, right? If you tap into the oil well, it just starts gushing. At a certain point, it stops gushing. There's still a lot of oil in the well, but now you have to stimulate the well by injecting CO2, by injecting, different things that are.
And that's the premise of fracking, right?
Oh, that's a well, sort of, fracking you have to be stimulating the well from the very beginning, right? Because it's trapped in shale rock.
Okay,
but we'll get to that in a second.
Right.
But a normal formation, that's a normal oil formation. Once you drill down, like Spindletop, when they hit in Texas, when they hit this north of Houston back in 1913 or 1917, whenever it was,
East Texas oil.
As soon as they struck oil, it blew the top off the top of the rig and was spurs, this huge gusher of oil for it took them 3 weeks to put it up.
Those are those cliche demonstrations in old movies where we struck it rich, black gold coming out as a geyser.
So what these state oil companies do is they get to the cheap part of the oil production cycle, and then when it starts getting expensive, because you have to start stimulating the well with various technologies, they just stop right there and move on to the next well and do the same thing. Right. So another thing has happened by the early 2000s, which is that all these state oil companies have gone through all their, not the Saudis, but let's say Mexico and these others have gone through all of their easy oil. And now they're finding that, and now they've hit sort of peak oil on the easy oil. But they haven't really done anything to invest in new capacity, new stimulation, and stuff like that. So that part of and this is the point that I'm getting to, that part of world oil production that is in the hand of state-owned companies is extremely brittle. It is not flexible. It does not respond well to price signals. I mean, the Saudis are price makers because they're in an almost quasi. Not a monopoly position, but they can make the price. But they don't respond that well to price signals just organically, right? And so the only part of the world's oil production that is in private hands is American oil production, in which all oil production is private, right? And that's 10%. Now it's 10%, maybe more, 15% since the shale boom. That percentage of world oil production that is in the hands of American companies gives the world oil production all of its price responsiveness and elasticity and adaptability and capacity to respond to price signals, right? And as a result of this, so all of what I've told you now is you can easily verify. What I'm going to tell you now is my opinion, which your opinion is as good as mine, but my opinion is that as a result of the fact that so imagine that the U.S. world oil production is the tip of a whiplash, of a whip. And it's the one that it has to move very fast at the end of this long whip, which is all of world's oil production, right? The very tip of it is the one that can whip up and down quickly. But all of the tension that's in the entire world oil production, when it's misaligned by several degrees down or up, is amplified into the tip that is in private company hands. And this gives an extraordinary boom and bust pattern to American oil production. And so you see that they just almost can't escape it, right? And so what you have is when world oil production gets too constricted and prices go up, or if all the stop oils of the world, all of these protesters get their way, or under the new, all these new government policies that do the same thing unintentionally that OPEC does, which is to restrict oil production. That drives up oil prices. It creates windfall profits for oil companies, and it's a huge signal to everyone in Texas to start drilling again. Because these are all, fracking, by the way, is what big oil companies do, whether it's Pemex or Shell, is they go offshore and they go a mile under the water and another mile underground with a single well that produces hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. In West Texas, what they're doing is all these guys that are setting up a pad or a couple hundred pads or a couple dozen pads to do fracking, and so that is a much more heterogeneous sector in terms of the size of the players that are involved.
Because you have to get the rights, the royalty rights, right?
Well, there's that, but even before, it's just the nature of the operation because to stimulate a well when you're fracking the well just requires like a lot of engineering on site for just the 4 wells that you're doing on the pad. There's like a diamond pattern is typically what you call a pad, and so there's 4 wells that are being fracked in different directions.
So it's a more technically sophisticated process,
and it just lends itself to operations and engineering by smaller.
And they run that on generators, or is it on the
firms.
grid?
Good question, right? Actually, they often run on electricity. These things are flaring huge amounts of natural gas, so they can often just run autonomously, I think, off the same natural gas that they have on site and still run enormous amounts of natural gas. Well, I actually don't know what power source they're using to do this stuff, but anyway, so when world oil production is constricted and oil prices rise and gasoline gets above $4 a gallon, all of a sudden everybody goes back in and starts fracking in the Permian Basin in West Texas again, or the Eagle Ford in South Texas. And then they start making billions and billions and billions of dollars. More and more people get in, and all of a sudden the margins start getting cut. Oil goes from $120 a barrel to $80 to $60 to $50 to $40, and now at $40, everyone's barely breaking even. Right? I think the break even, and even that took. I mean, when at the beginning of the shale boom, when they first started fracking, break even was like $80 or $90 a barrel.
And you'd say that would that be 2005, something like that, or a little later?
2011, 2012, 13, 12, 13, 14. Yeah. And so the break even for these guys was $80 a barrel, and but it's the ingenuity that only American private companies are capable of. I mean, in the oil market, in the oil production market. They were able to drive that down to $40, even $30 a barrel. So now they're able to make profit at very low levels. And, they've gotten into a lot of debt in order to finance all this capital investment. And all of a sudden the Saudis are like, we're going to wipe you guys out. When your bond payments are coming due at the beginning of 2020 or at the beginning of 2019, whatever, we're going to double oil production again, and all of you are going to get wiped out, and you're not going to be able to pay your bonds, and then you're all going to go bankrupt, and then a massive wave of bankruptcies follow, and like hundreds of companies go bankrupt in Texas. And so as a result, the Texans have been... the Texans, and these are like the most red meat, God-fearing conservatives in the United States. They've been crying out for the government to reinstitute the Texas Railroad Commission.
We talked about the TRC in length in the last episode, right?
So and of course the Texas Railroad Commission was the original,
of course, regulator. Yeah.
Oil government oil cartel that OPEC was based on, right? So OPEC copied the model of the Texas Railroad Commission, and of course, Texas Railroad Commission it has not been disbanded. It's still a very important energy regulator in Texas, but it stopped using production quotas to cartelize oil production in Texas, like in the 70s during this big wave of deregulation. And they want it back, and I've argued in the Atlantic and elsewhere that I feel for them, but the last thing that you want is more government cartelization of oil production.
So this would be more of on the one hand, it's not only in the best interest of American oil industry, but also, like, say, from a American national interest perspective, in terms of competing with other oil producers in the world. Yeah.
So what I think is that there is a problem. There is a major tension, and that causes a lot of billionaires, but it causes a lot of pain and suffering in the United States. There is a major tension between private American oil production and cartelized monopoly oil production in the rest of the world.
Right.
And that tension should not be resolved by cartelizing the American market. It should be resolved by privatizing the rest of world oil production.
Yeah.
Which I think should be a big part of our international diplomacy. And so it's the biggest problem in one of the biggest problems in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. interests abroad is the fact that so little of the world's energy economy is in private hands. Because the more of it is in private hands, the more the world oil energy production would tend to emphasize things like regulatory stability, rule of law, and
More
stuff
natural
like that.
market principles than intervention.
Yeah, and private rights, innovation, social mobility, pluralistic societies, and just all of the things that go with it, as opposed to a system where a bunch of Saddams are in charge or whatever, and what do you need there? It's not the rule of law; it's a big army, right? And a mukabarat to terrify the people, right? So this makes the region very unstable, and it makes Mexico very unstable, and it makes Brazil and Colombia unstable, right? And that's a big problem for the U.S. So the success of I think the success of freedom in the United States depends on the success of freedom around the world. And I think that this is true at a constitutional level. It's true in terms of democratic politics, and it's true in terms of the energy economies. Anyway, so I just wanted to make that final point on that score.
Yeah, and I guess another thing that we were really interested in, because I know you speak about the government's role, specifically the federal government, in kind of using its levers that are available to it. I know the Federal Reserve and its impact on interest rates. They can buy and sell at will with their open market operations, but in the same way, we try to draw a parallel between the strategic petroleum reserves that Biden famously released, like a couple million barrels of oil.
Oh no, 300 million.
300 million, yeah.
Half the reserve. He sold half the reserve.
And could you talk about that's impact and what kind of precedent that sets, whether it's a good direction, a bad direction?
It's a terrible direction, right?
Right.
I mean, the reason that we have these oil reserves in the first place is to stave off the scarcity crises of the night. So the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created pursuant to the Memorandum of Understanding, or whatever the organic document was that created the International Energy Agency. And the International Energy Agency was created as a result of the oil shock of 1974, right? And it's Japan and Europe and the United States getting together and saying, how do we prevent this from happening again? Because this was really not fun.
Right.
This
is the one that's based in Paris, I believe, or France.
The IEA is I thought it was Geneva, but maybe it's Paris. Yeah. And so you have so the purpose of the IEA, which its executive director has apparently forgotten, is to prevent disruptions in the oil supply. So the purpose of the Strategic Petroleum Reserves are as a fail-safe in case of a disruption in the oil supply.
A last resort, right?
Why would there be a disruption in the oil supply? Because Iran invades Saudi Arabia, right? Because there's some catastrophic event around the world, and there's a disruption in the oil supply. Disruption in the oil supply does not mean that you start charging more for oil leases on federal lands, and as a result, the price of gasoline goes up, and now everyone's complaining about it, and you're like, oh, I did that.
It was the incorrect response to a manageable situation.
Yeah, and it's not supposed to be used for price signals. It's not supposed to be used to sell high and then buy low.
Would that be an example, you would say, of, let's say, the state cartelization of the
right.
oil?
It's this political manipulation of 15% of the nation's economy. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve rests on very weak analytical foundations to begin with, right? Because the world oil production wasn't as disruptable as it seemed in the Saudis didn't maintain their embargo for very long, right? And they discovered that other people could fill the gap. Actually, they brought other people in.
A lot more competition than they thought.
And we know a lot. We understand a lot that we didn't know in the 1970s. For example, we thought we were about to reach peak oil. Getting back to the original question, soon in the early 1980s, and we have more proven reserves under the ground today than we had in 1982, right? Yeah. Which is an incredible fact because we've consumed 90 billion barrels of oil since then, and yet we have more reserves now than we did then. Why? Because oil especially when it's in private hands, oil production has a dynamic of investing in further exploration as it produces. So that Shell has been as Shell produces oil, it's always on the hunt for new oil wells, and it's always got more on the horizon.
And the discoveries that come with that development.
And the shale stuff, I remember when I was in my first Senate job looking at this, and people were saying this is going to be a big thing. And I thought, in the future, there's going to be this thing called shale oil. And I would see the projections on estimated reserves. And it was, the proven reserves, which did not include shale oil, were very tiny. But the shale ones were
very,
huge.
Very amazing
just
prospects.
Amazing. Canada, tar sands was oh my God, you could feed all the world from this oil for 50 years. But it was all theoretical 15 years ago.
Right.
Now this, old Texan George Mitchell put together two technologies that had existed for a long time, one of which was directional drilling and the other was hydraulic fracturing. Mm. And he put them together and he said, we can do directional drilling with hydraulic fracturing. And now you can go throughout the entire shale play from single pads.
And that's the same as horizontal drilling. That's what I think I've heard it as.
Yeah, horizontal drilling is, it's not just horizontal, it's directional. Right,
Okay, yeah.
The Clean Air Act is a law that cleaned up the environment a lot in the United States. And what it did, the idea of the Clean Air Act, as in so much of environmental regulation, is that when economic production has externalities, which are costs that the producer does not pay, that other people pay who are not related to that production, like the neighborhood, right? The idea is that the proper way to approach environmental regulation is to force polluters to internalize in their cost of production those things that are now externalities, like pollution, right? And so companies have the Clean Air Act has been not perfect, but it's been largely successful doing that, and companies have adapted to, really reduce their output because it's a cost for them. The Clean Air Act makes pollution a cost. So to reduce the cost, they reduce their pollution. It's really cleaned up the environment, and it's great. The problem that I see on the horizon, and the chickens are starting to come home to roost now, like I was saying under the Paris Agreement, is that they're trying to treat now. The Biden-Harris EPA has passed a rule for power plants that treats the climate change as an externality of energy production, and as a result, now we're using the proxy of carbon dioxide as the measure of impacting the climate, and so they're saying that the power plants have to basically eliminate all their carbon emissions, and if natural gas plants can eliminate all their carbon emissions through carbon capture and storage, we'll let them stay online, and otherwise they have to shut down. And they don't seem to be terribly concerned by the fact that the natural gas power sector, which is responsible for 60% of U.S. electricity, or 40% of U.S. electricity, is not investing in carbon capture in response to the rule. They're getting ready to shut down, and they don't seem to be concerned. And my theory for why they're not concerned is that a lot of these clean energy people, as long as they shut down fossil fuel production, they are not terribly concerned about whether adequate renewable replacements come online, because if they don't come online, then everybody's going to depend on the government for welfare. And we see the results now in Europe, which is that, in Germany, electricity prices are 4 times what they are in the United States, 4 times what they are in Florida, and Volkswagen is talking about shutting down their plants over there. And the Europeans are starting to see that they are paying, the Chinese and the Indians aren't doing anything to cut back on development. I mean, they're trying to make it cleaner and stuff, but they're not going to sacrifice economic development for carbon emissions goals. And the only people who have so far been willing to do that and have really put their money where their mouths are is in Europe. And the Europeans are facing deindustrialization. And it's turning into what I call climate colonialism, by the way, because all the rare earth minerals for this incredible amounts of utility scale battery and electric vehicle car batteries that they need, all this stuff has to come from somewhere, and it's not coming from Schwarzwald. It's coming from, right? It's coming from somewhere in the third world. And
Latin America, Africa, different mining.
Yeah. And I'll just close with this. I mean, I think that people are, at some point, people talk about saving the planet and climate change is an existential threat. And I think that it's very lazy to talk that way, because the convenience of talking about it that way is that it gets you off the hook of having to do cost-benefit analysis, right? Because if you're trying to save the planet, it doesn't matter what the costs are. It's whatever it takes, okay? But when you read through the IPCC, like, what is the danger of climate change? Disruptions in food systems, disruptions in water systems, people who can't, get food, people who can't feed their kids, disruptions in healthcare outcomes. When the Saudis unleashed the oil weapon against the United States and Israel in 1973, it caused big lines around the corner at gas stations in the United States, but it caused catastrophic famines in Africa, which was not the intended result, right?
Because it disrupted the logistics.
It disrupted these very fragile food and water systems and access to things, and all of a sudden they can't get food. Yeah. And so at a certain point, you have to, when energy prices start to go up and you're not replacing them with adequate renewables, you're not replacing the retiring fossil fuel with adequate renewables, you have to ask yourself, wait a second, what are the dangers that we're trying to avoid? Because I see people, I see now Germany desperately scrounging for, Germany's thrown 60 years of fiscal discipline out the window with welfare programs to cushion the blow for retirees and poor people of high energy prices, which, by the way, are grossly regressive and impact poor people most of all. And so Greta Thunberg likes to say, climate change is a death sentence for millions of the world's poor. The jury's still out on that. What is certain is that Greta Thunberg's policies would be a death sentence for millions of the world's poor. And so this is something that I think is becoming increasingly obvious to people who are really living through it in Europe. It's been obvious to the adults in the room at the COP, which are like the head of the COP last year was also the head of United Arab Emirates National Oil Company. The Saudi oil minister at the COP said, if the Europeans want to go without oil, let them try and see how far they get, right? And so I think that you've got enough adults in the room over there that it's starting to turn the conversation. Unfortunately, Europe's governing class does not have many of those adults in it yet, but it will soon.
And that wraps up today's insightful conversation with Dr. Mario Loyola. We covered a lot of ground, touching upon the storied history of global oil production and the role national oil companies play in shaping that landscape. We dove into the lasting impact of the U.S. shale boom, which transformed its position in the global oil market, making its private producers key players in stabilizing prices. Dr. Loyola highlighted how this created a unique dynamic where U.S. production acts like the tip of a whip, highly elastic and responsive to price signals, whereas much of the rest of the world's production remains rigid and slow-moving. Finally, we discussed the ongoing tension between the private sector and cartels like OPEC, as well as the important role of U.S. diplomacy and what it can do to promote privatization and market-based principles. As Dr. Loyola pointed out, ensuring more of the world's energy is in private hands could lead to a greater stability, innovation, and economic freedom across the globe. Well, I want to thank you for tuning in to this second installment of the Panther Business Briefing. Next week, we will synthesize the insights we've researched and heard, and then we'll share them with you when we conclude our final class on oil and gas.